decades, people have disappeared in wilderness regions across the world without leaving enough evidence to explain where they went. Search teams have found abandoned equipment. Tracking dogs have lost scent trails without warning. And experienced hikers have vanished from areas they knew well. Some were eventually recovered in locations that had already been searched, while others were never seen again. Most of those disappearances probably have ordinary explanations. Exposure, injury, disorientation, animal attacks, and simple human error can all become lethal in remote terrain. But after what happened beneath Eilean Moor, I was carrying something that made me question whether a small number of those cases belonged to something else entirely. The cartographer had given me a map before leaving Flannan. It was a sheet of black material covered in thin, pale roots that changed when I wasn't looking directly at them, and I had kept it hidden exactly as he had warned me to do. For several weeks, nothing changed, and then one night, a new pattern appeared across its surface. It began as a single pale line and spread outward like a fracture in glass. Dozens of branches formed from one central point, dividing again and again until the pattern looked less like roads and more like veins beneath skin. The scale was too deliberate to ignore, and the longer I studied it, the more certain I became that the lines were not marking anything on the surface. I compared the pattern against terrain data and realized the roots were running underground. Then I began matching their endpoints against archived wilderness disappearance reports, expecting the connection to fall apart after the first few cases. Instead, one coordinate after another landed beneath locations associated with unexplained missing person incidents, separated by years and sometimes decades. The pattern should have been impossible. Some of the disappearances were hundreds of kilometers apart, yet the routes beneath the map repeatedly converged on the same hidden structure. I photographed only the coordinates, removed every trace of the black map from the files, and sent the locations to Director Hale with a request for underground surveys. 4 hours later, Hale called me into operations. The briefing room was already full when I arrived, with Commander Shaw, Echo 7, combat engineers, geologists, containment specialists, medical teams, and tactical commanders from units I had never seen before. On the main display was a three-dimensional model of a remote wilderness region with hundreds of underground passages highlighted beneath the forests and mountains. Some of the tunnels appeared natural, but others were too straight and too uniform. Several sections had clearly been widened or shaped, while deeper branches continued beyond the effective range of the Foundation's equipment. When Hale overlaid missing person data across the surface above them, almost every major underground route passed beneath a recorded disappearance. Nobody in the room spoke for several seconds. Hale looked directly at me and asked where I had found the coordinates, and I told him I would explain once I knew what we were dealing with. He didn't like the answer, but 27 hours later, Echo 7 and I were standing inside the exclusion zone. The Foundation had established a cover story involving geological instability and an ongoing search operation. Local authorities were pushed beyond an outer perimeter. Civilian aircraft were redirected, and communications around the area were restricted. From the surface, it still looked like an unusually large search and rescue effort, but Foundation scanners had already located something beneath the forest. A recently missing adult hiker had vanished less than 3 kilometers away. Search dogs followed his scent directly toward a collapsed rock face before stopping so abruptly that the handlers initially assumed the dogs had become confused. They had not, and every animal refused to move closer to the stone. Ground radar showed empty space behind the rock face. Combat engineers removed enough debris to expose a narrow opening, and Echo 7 entered, while the surface teams prepared a larger access route behind us. The first section looked like an ordinary cave, but within 40 meters, the passage widened and tool marks began appearing beneath centuries of mineral growth. Someone had worked these tunnels. The walls had been cut, widened, and shaped by hands that had been there long before modern excavation machinery existed. We continued deeper until one of the operators raised a hand and stopped the column. A backpack was lying against the wall. Inside were modern food wrappers, spare clothing, a water filter, and a dead phone belonging to a man who had disappeared 4 years earlier. 50 meters farther in, we found a camera from the 1990s, then an old hunting rifle, boots, a compass, broken spectacles, and objects that clearly came from different decades. The tunnel eventually opened into a chamber containing human remains. Some were recent enough that clothing still survived around them, while others had been there long enough for almost nothing to remain except bone. The discovery changed the atmosphere instantly because we were no longer dealing with an unexplored cave system. Then the motion sensors activated. Something was moving toward us through an adjoining passage at speed, and Echo 7 formed a defensive line while the thermal operator brought the scanner up. One low heat signature appeared beyond the light, then another, followed by 4 more, and finally a cluster large enough to fill the screen. The first creature entered the beam on all 4s. It was pale, hairless, and unnaturally thin, with long limbs and fingers curled against the stone as it moved with the speed of an animal. I recognized the species immediately from previous void-related incidents. A white crawler stared back at us from the darkness. It did not look confused or displaced like the specimens we had encountered near temporary breaches, and its posture was different from anything I had seen before. It looked completely at home. The tunnel exploded into movement. Crawlers came across the floor, walls and ceiling, while Echo 7 opened fire and began falling back in controlled stages. The front rank collapsed under the first bursts, but the creatures behind simply climbed over the bodies and continued forward. 2 operators fired while the next pair withdrew. Then the team switched positions and repeated the movement. Nobody ran and nobody broke formation, but the crawlers continued gaining ground. We were nearly back to the main passage when movement erupted behind us. One of the creatures had emerged through a side opening we had missed. It was dragging a human being by both ankles, and the man was still alive. Echo 7 drove the crawler away, recovered the victim, and pulled him into the center of the formation before continuing the withdrawal. The missing hiker had been gone for 3 days. He was dehydrated, injured, and barely conscious, but there were deep abrasions around both ankles, showing that something had dragged him across the stone for a considerable distance. At that moment, the entire operation changed. We weren't dealing with people accidentally wandering into the void. The crawlers were coming out, taking people and carrying them underground. The wilderness disappearances above us had not been random encounters with an unstable boundary. The moment we reached the surface, Hale ordered the entire area sealed. Before the perimeter could even finish repositioning, every seismic sensor triggered simultaneously, and the ground beneath the forest trembled. Foundation instruments registered an energy spike so powerful that several systems shut down. The signal wasn't coming from the entrance we had just used. It was coming from kilometers below us, somewhere beneath the mountains. I finally pulled the black map from inside my coat and unfolded it in front of Hale. The pale routes had changed again. Every tunnel line on the map was now converging toward one central point beneath the range, and a shape had formed there that had not existed before. Hale stared at the map, then at me, and asked where I had obtained it. I told him the cartographer had given it to me. For several seconds, he said nothing at all. And then he ordered every deep-range instrument in the region redirected toward the coordinates. The results came back within the hour. There was a cavern beneath the mountain so large that the first scan had interpreted it as corrupted data. Inside that space was an energy signature consistent with a breach, but the readings were beyond anything the Foundation had previously recorded. Hale stopped calling it an investigation. The operation changed designation immediately. Civilian search activity was terminated, military exclusion protocols were activated, and every available Foundation combat resource within range was redirected toward the site. For the first time since joining the Foundation, I saw what happened when containment was treated as a war. The first convoy arrived after dark. Heavy lorries rolled through the forest under blackout conditions, followed by armored troop carriers, engineering vehicles, mobile generators, communications platforms, ammunition carriers, excavation rigs, and hardened medical units. Then came vehicles carrying equipment concealed beneath reinforced covers. The armory trucks opened hydraulically along their sides. Weapons racks extended from floor to ceiling, containing standard Foundation rifles, heavy automatic systems, compact tunnel weapons, powered recoil assemblies, and ammunition in quantities I had never seen deployed outside a military stockpile. Operators began loading immediately, while other teams moved equipment toward the underground access point. Another convoy brought the sentries. The first Aegis unit walked down a loading ramp on 4 reinforced mechanical legs, nearly 3 meters high, with twin heavy automatic weapons mounted on a rotating armored upper assembly. Thermal optics, LiDAR, acoustic tracking, seismic integration, and Foundation identification systems covered every approach around it. 7 more Aegis sentries followed. Smaller Cerberus motion turrets were unloaded behind them, alongside reconnaissance drones, portable blast doors, suppression pylons, powered assault frames, and crates of tunnel denial charges. The machines did not look like equipment designed for an investigation. By midnight, the forest had become a forward operating base. Floodlights turned the trees white. Helicopters circled beyond the perimeter, and combat engineers widened the underground access route until powered systems could descend. Medical stations, satellite communications, ammunition points, and hardened command vehicles filled the staging area. Hundreds of Foundation personnel moved through the site. Echo 7 stood beside me, watching Aegis units line up beside the tunnel entrance, while loaders attached ammunition feeds and technicians completed final diagnostics. One of the operators quietly told me He had never seen the Foundation deploy this much firepower to a single breach. Operation Black Descent began at 0410. 3 assault groups entered the network simultaneously, with Echo 7 leading the central push while Alpha cleared forward routes, Bravo secured intersections, and Charlie deployed Cerberus sentries facing every uncleared passage. Combat engineers followed behind, installing blast barriers and preparing demolition charges at designated fallback positions. Every section we captured became a fortified corridor back toward the surface. Reconnaissance drones went ahead. Thermal teams checked each branch, and seismic sensors were drilled into the stone before the next movement began. The system was slow, methodical, and designed to prevent anything from slipping behind us. At the first major junction, 3 reconnaissance drones entered separate passages. 2 returned without contact, but the third transmitted for only 17 seconds before its signal disappeared. The final image showed dozens of white crawlers standing completely still along both walls, staring directly into the drone's camera. We sealed that branch and continued. At the next junction, the seismic array detected movement through solid rock on our left, even though the tunnel map showed no opening there. One of the Cerberus turrets rotated toward the wall before anyone else reacted. 3 seconds later, the stone burst outward. Crawlers poured through the opening, and the remotely controlled turret opened fire, while Echo 7 reinforced the position. Dust and muzzle flashes filled the passage as engineers dragged a portable, armored barrier across the breach. The crawlers continued attacking until the opening was almost filled with bodies. The barrier finally slammed shut and locked into the stone, while demolition teams prepared charges behind it. We moved deeper before another attack could develop. Evidence of missing people became more common as we descended. Backpacks, clothing, cameras, boots, phones, and camping equipment appeared beside objects that were obviously far older than the modern missing 411 cases. We found metalwork more than a century old, fragments of ceramic containers and personal items nobody could immediately date. The tunnel system had been active for generations. More disturbing was the way the crawlers responded to our advance, because they began bypassing fixed positions and deliberately triggering sensors in one corridor before attacking another. They weren't simply animals using tunnels as shelter. They understood the network. They knew where our defensive lines were forming, and they were testing them. Hale eventually reached the same conclusion and authorized the Aegis sentries to move to the front. We heard the machines coming before we saw them. Heavy mechanical legs struck the stone in a slow rhythm, while hydraulic systems adjusted with every step. 2 Aegis units passed Echo 7 and continued toward a long straight passage where thermal sensors had detected an approaching mass. The first estimate was more than 200 crawlers. The Aegis machines positioned themselves side by side, spread their stabilizing legs, and drove anchors into the stone, while Foundation infantry pulled back behind them. Their twin weapon assemblies rotated toward the darkness. The tunnel ahead began moving. Crawlers filled the floor, walls, and ceiling until the entire passage seemed alive. Hale cleared the firing lane and authorized the sentries. Both Aegis units opened fire together. The tunnel became a continuous wall of light as heavy automatic fire tore through the advancing mass, and the machines tracked targets faster than any human team could have managed. Crawlers were thrown backward into the darkness while others climbed across the bodies and continued forward. For almost a minute, nothing reached the defensive line. Then, the ammunition counters began falling, and Echo 7 advanced, while the sentries continued firing behind us. The Foundation was no longer simply exploring the tunnels. It was carving a route through them. Hours passed before the geology changed. Natural stone gave way to worked passageways, and those eventually disappeared into walls made from a black material identical to substances recovered during previous void incidents. The temperature dropped rapidly, and several navigation systems began failing. Compasses became useless. Radio transmissions occasionally repeated fractions of a second before the speaker actually spoke. Every reading suggested the boundary around us was becoming unstable. Then, we found another chamber. It was not the central cavern, but the moment Foundation floodlights came on, every operator stopped moving. Thousands of personal objects covered the ground. Backpacks, shoes, wallets, watches, cameras, jewelry, hunting equipment, and phones stretched across the chamber. Some had been manufactured within the last few years, while others looked old enough to belong in museums. There were far too many for this network to belong to one region. I opened the black map again. More routes appeared across its surface, extending toward North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Remote forests, mountain regions, and wilderness zones began connecting through paths that could not exist physically beneath oceans and continents. The tunnel network wasn't crossing the planet underground. It was connecting separate access points through the void. The cartographer had not given me a map of caves. He had given me a map of doors. The alarm started before Hale could respond. Every seismic sensor behind us activated at once as movement began approaching from multiple directions. The crawlers were moving to cut off the assault force from the surface. Aegis sentries rotated toward secondary tunnels, Cerberus systems armed, portable blast doors closed, and demolition teams moved to fallback positions. The careful underground advance ended in seconds. The war began everywhere at once. Reports flooded the command channel from sectors spread across the network, with crawlers breaching sealed passages, damaging sentries, and appearing behind units that believed their routes were secure. Medical teams started receiving casualties, while fresh Foundation units pushed deeper to reinforce collapsing positions. Echo 7 kept moving toward the central chamber. We passed damaged Aegis units still tracking movement, with shattered armor, Cerberus turrets firing down side passages, and wounded operators being carried toward the surface, while ammunition teams came past them in the opposite direction. The scale of the fighting had grown beyond anything I had seen inside the Foundation. Then the tunnel ended. The central cavern was so large that our floodlights could not reach the ceiling. The bar wall vanished into darkness, and standing at the center of the chamber was a rupture in reality hundreds of meters high. It looked like a vertical wound cut through the world. Beyond it was a pale landscape beneath a colorless sky. Thousands of shapes moved on the other side, while white crawlers covered the surrounding rock, climbing over one another and dropping from ledges around the breach. More were already coming through. The Foundation had underestimated their numbers by an order of magnitude. Hale gave the command immediately, and containment teams moved forward while the entire assault force reorganized around them. This was the objective every vehicle, weapon, and operator had been brought underground to reach. Suppression pylons were transported into position beneath armed escort. Aegis sentries formed a defensive semicircle, while Cerberus systems covered the side tunnels, and heavy weapons teams in powered frames took positions between them. Echo 7 moved into the center as combat engineers began anchoring the containment equipment to the cavern floor. Reconnaissance drones rose into the darkness. Thousands of white crawlers stopped moving and turned toward the foundation line. For several seconds, the entire chamber became completely still. Then, one of them screamed. Every creature in the cavern attacked at once, descending from the walls, crossing the ceiling and pouring through the breach. Hale gave the firing order, and the foundation opened up. The sound became almost physical. Heavy automatic weapons, sentries, rifles, and explosives turned the cavern into a storm of muzzle flashes and dust, while Aegis units rotated continuously between targets. Crawlers fell in waves, but the space behind them filled immediately. Aegis 3 shifted its weapons toward creatures moving across the ceiling. Aegis 5 held a side tunnel, while Aegis 6 vanished beneath a mass of crawlers that climbed over its chassis faster than it could turn. Its weapons continued firing even after the machine went down. The first suppression pylon activated. The breach distorted, and half the cavern briefly disappeared behind an image of the pale landscape on the other side. When reality snapped back into place, several crawlers were suddenly inside the foundation perimeter. Echo 7 eliminated them before they reached the containment teams. The second pylon activated moments later, and the breach began to contract. Every crawler in the cavern reacted immediately. They knew the door was closing. Their attacks became more violent and more coordinated as entire groups targeted the containment line instead of the soldiers protecting it. One broke through long enough to tear into the control assembly of the third pylon before being killed. The final pylon failed. Without it, the containment field could not collapse the breach completely. The damaged unit sat nearly 70 meters beyond our position, with hundreds of crawlers between it and the defensive line. Hale ordered engineers to prepare a replacement, but there wasn't enough time. Aegis 3 was almost out of ammunition. Aegis 5 had lost one weapon assembly, and Charlie had abandoned the eastern defensive tunnel. Medical personnel were fighting beside the infantry because there was nobody else left to hold the perimeter. Echo 7's commander looked at me. 4 operators moved with us before I even had time to answer, and Aegis 5 rotated its remaining weapon toward the center lane. The machine opened fire and gave us a corridor. We ran behind the sentry fire. Crawlers attacked from both sides, while Echo 7 kept them away from the center, and one operator was thrown against the stone hard enough to crack his armor. Another creature crossed directly in front of me before disappearing beneath automatic fire. We reached the damaged pylon. The main controls had been destroyed, but manual activation remained possible if somebody stayed beside the unit long enough to complete the sequence. I started the process while Echo 7 formed a defensive circle around me. The countdown began at 30 seconds. Crawlers poured through the smoke, while the remaining Aegis continued firing somewhere behind us. By 22 seconds, its weapon noise stopped. The machine was empty. The crawlers surged forward immediately, and Echo 7 burned through their remaining magazines trying to hold them back. The containment sequence continued while the breach began expanding again. At 12 seconds, a wave of pressure tore through the cavern and knocked everyone to the ground. Human voices began coming through the breach, hundreds of them calling, crying, and shouting from somewhere beyond the pale landscape. I looked through the rupture and thought I saw people standing in the distance behind the crawlers. Some looked modern. Others looked as though they belonged to different decades. I couldn't tell whether they were survivors, echoes, or something the void was using to keep us from closing the door. Hale's voice came over the radio and ordered me to finish the sequence. Echo 7 pulled themselves back into position as the countdown reached its final seconds. The crawlers were almost on top of us. The activation completed. I hit the manual control and the third pylon came online. Every light in the cavern turned white. The breach folded inward and thousands of crawlers screamed together as though the entire species had suddenly become one voice. Rock tore from the cavern walls while creatures and equipment began sliding toward the collapsing rupture. Hale ordered immediate withdrawal. Echo 7 dragged me away from the pylon, and we ran toward the secured route while the breach contracted behind us. Hundreds of meters became 50, then 20, then only a few. The last thing I saw through the opening was the pale landscape beyond. Something enormous was moving in the distance behind the remaining crawlers, far larger than anything we had encountered in the tunnels. Before I could see more, the breach closed. The cavern went dark. Then the mountain began collapsing around us. Every demolition charge along the retreat corridor activated in sequence. Tunnel after tunnel came down behind the withdrawing foundation units, while blast doors sealed secondary branches and engineering teams destroyed routes the crawlers could still use. The network was being erased as we escaped it. At the final junction, Aegis 2 had exhausted its ammunition. Engineers locked its mechanical legs across the tunnel and armed demolition charges around the machine. The sentry became the final barrier before the entire passage collapsed around it. We reached the surface minutes before the main collapse. The ground moved beneath the entire forward operating base. Trees shook and heavy vehicles bounced on their suspension as the mountain absorbed the destruction below. Several kilometers away, part of the wilderness dropped inward beneath a rising cloud of dust. Then everything stopped. Seismic movement disappeared, the breach signature vanished, and every remaining sensor reported silence beneath the forest. No crawlers were detected anywhere in the surviving tunnels. The Foundation spent the next 48 hours confirming the result. The central breach was sealed, and the accessible network beneath the region had been destroyed. No further hostile movement appeared. The missing hiker survived. 3 other living victims were recovered during the assault and eventually returned through carefully controlled explanations involving an undocumented cave system and an extended search effort. Everything else recovered underground disappeared into classified Foundation storage. Before we left, Hale met me alone. He placed the black map on the table between us and made it clear that he knew I had concealed both the map and my contact with the cartographer. I expected him to confiscate it. Instead, he pushed it back toward me. Hale told me that if the map changed again, he wanted to know, and I asked whether that was an order. He looked toward the sealed equipment cases being loaded outside and told me it was a request. I folded the map and put it away. The tunnel routes beneath that wilderness were gone, and the central breach had vanished from its surface. For once, the Foundation had not simply delayed something it couldn't understand. We had stopped it. The regional network was destroyed, the crawlers were cut off, and the breach had been sealed permanently. For at least some of the people who vanished into the wilderness, we finally knew what had happened. They had not wandered away. They had not simply become lost or disappeared into nothing. Something had come out of the ground, taken them, and dragged them beneath the wilderness into a network humanity never knew existed. The Foundation found that network. We went down into it, fought our way through an army waiting beneath the surface, and reached the breach at its center. Then we closed the door. Black File 027B was finished. The missing 411 operation had become the largest underground assault the Foundation had ever mounted. And this time, there was no unresolved ending waiting behind us. The underground war was over, and the case was closed.